Hello, and welcome to our devlog for the itch.io weekly game jam 169, Mimic Panic. The theme for this week's game jam was Treasure Hunt. The jam started at 6 PM, and we had a whole week, so we spent the first evening brainstorming ideas. After throwing out a lot of ideas, we were down to 4. An underwater sunken ship exploration game, a demon summoning game, a jewel thief game, and a mimic game. We settled on the mimic game, as we really liked the idea of the treasure hunting you. Now I will pass over to Sean, another one of our artists, so he can talk about asset creation.
Hello, my name is Sean Croucher. I was one of the asset modelers and tech artists for this week's game jam. For this project we decided to go for a low poly look. We used only a single colour palette as our texture file for all of the assets. This meant that we wouldn't have to worry about performance anywhere near as much, as everything would be using the same material and texture. My first task was to help with the asset creation process. So I modelled a number of environmental assets, the most notable being the door, as it had to be destroyable. I coordinated with Tom for this, choosing to make the door with various stages of damage. This was easier than I thought, as I only had to move around the beams that made the doors up without having to worry about the UVs. I also played with topology a bit and again didn't have to change the UVs. My second task was to help finalise the character. Tom had already done a lot of setup, allowing the player to interact with the environment and pick up items and so on. I didn't want to risk breaking any of his work, so before I started I duplicated the character so I could work on it without destroying any of his previous work. I first had to switch out the native Unreal character with our Mimic and then create a new animation blueprint for it. Once I'd done that, I made a 1D blend space so the transition between idle and walking would be smooth. I then created an anim graph that allowed me to control the various states which the character would be in. I did this using just 2 booleans and a cast, and with this I was able to make the character go between hiding, idle and walking. I really enjoyed this project, and it definitely challenged me, as I hadn't really worked with swatches or the low poly style before.
And on to tech.
Hello, my name is Tom Paul. I was the game designer, gameplay programmer, Blender instructor, and one of the many asset modelers for this week's project. We started the game hoping to record every aspect of the development process, how we work as a team, and each of our individual workflow techniques. My first job was making sure everyone was acquainted with using the open source software Blender, as this was going to quickly become our main DCC tool during the jam. So I started a crash course on the first day, giving out the basics of the interface and Blender's modeling workflow. While giving out tips and tricks in Blender and recap lessons for those needing more help, I was also in charge of programming the gameplay. I had to make sure the scope was low enough to manage both jobs and allow the completion of the project as well. So I set out to make 3 main mechanics. The first mechanic was the most obvious: movement. We wanted our character to feel fluid, responsive and chaotic at the same time. So I ended up using a point-and-click preset along with a click and drag command to allow the character to scurry freely around the scene. This was using a raycast and an AI directed by a navmesh guided floor. The second mechanic was the interact blueprint, which was apparent to a few more small mechanics. This blueprint encapsulated everything the character could interact with, from a door to an axe, a key, and even a bucket. You can easily find objects using the BP Interact blueprint because they get a white outline once hovered on with the cursor. The last mechanic was the wheel, which was simple enough to make. The wheel is self-explanatory. It's an object that takes in account how much the character physically rotates it, affecting the gates in the scene. Finally, the last thing I worked on was the UI. Very boilerplate, main menu we clicked on, an ending screen with an exit button, and an in-game UI which would become visible when certain events would be triggered. Finally, this project was a lot of fun to make, and I hope it turns out really fun to play as well. The recording experiment was a huge success, so stay tuned for more devlogs in the near future.
Thanks for watching. This was all made possible thanks to George Dyerson, Aidan Lonigan, Max Izakov, Tom Paul, Lena Sanford, Daniel Dutton, Sean Croucher, Zukil Abrahams, Chris Elliott, and me, Thea Rust, with special thanks to Harry Williams.